Please welcome our next speaker, Bonvissuto.
I always struggled speaking up. I joke that it's because my mother was a mime. Oh, she was. But really, I was painfully shy. I was always anticipating anxiety by trying to be perfect, polished, precise, and failing, so I just stayed silent. It was like I was watching myself from above, unable to participate fully in my life, stuck in an endless loop of thinking about thinking and being anxious about anxiety. The pain for me was in trying to project perfection, as if there was some imaginary plateau where I would someday be a better communicator, if only I worked hard enough. I know now that I felt constricted by a gender binary I just couldn't see myself in. I now have language to know that I'm gender nonconforming, non-binary. But when I was a kid, I had no sense of self because I didn't feel comfortable being myself. Speaking up about my gender identity is terrifying because right now, trans and gender nonconforming people are being criminalized for being ourselves all over this country. I believe change comes when we leverage the various aspects of our privilege to advocate for others, especially those who are most harmed by silencing systems in our society. It wasn't until I started speaking up about my anxiety that I felt seen and safe and supported. It wasn't until I started speaking up about my anxiety that I realized just how many of us are suffering in silence. Instead of blaming myself, I started to see how all of our voices are impacted by silencing systems, from internalized anxiety to systemic oppression, and how we can work together to dismantle silencing systems and rebuild them with new systems that support all of our voices. In my work, I help people feel more comfortable communicating by using systems thinking to create structure in spontaneous speaking moments. I believe we all communicate perfectly well when we feel seen, safe, and supported, something that is sadly a privilege for far too many people. I once saw a new client who came to me with lifelong unspoken anxiety. General counsel at a company you would all recognize, he was always the only Black man in the room. At the beginning of our first session, he was leaning back, he seemed comfortable. When I asked him a professional question, he sat up straight, leaned in, and his eyes started moving rapidly, a sign that he was holding his breath in deep thought. I asked what he was focusing on, and he said, finding the right words to sound professional. He couldn't hear himself think over the pressure to perform and be perfect. He was over-prioritizing how he was being perceived instead of focusing on what he wanted to say. The moment he leaned back and prioritized his own comfort, he was able to access and articulate his expertise. That same year, I worked with general counsel at another company you'd all recognize. A white woman, she exuded confidence and charisma and refused to admit any anxiety. Years later, she came back to see me and admitted that she had been secretly struggling with unspoken anxiety the entire time, but didn't feel safe to admit it. Not to herself, not to her team, not even to me. This is the cost of silencing systems in our society. People believe, or have been told, that in order to be visible and have a voice, they have to change how they show up and speak up to fit into a dominant default, which is white, male, straight, cis, strong, and confident. White male supremacy and capitalism have converged to create a dominant default that makes us all strive for perfection instead of being present with ourselves, and that hurts every single one of us. In their research from more than 20 years ago, Kenneth Jones and Tima Okun identified perfectionism as a tenet of white supremacy culture, where making a mistake is seen as being a mistake, doing wrong with being wrong. In most workplaces, feedback is often gendered, racist, and intangible. It's almost always about tone of voice or vague calls for confidence, but how we perceive confidence is biased and exclusionary based on arbitrary ideals, not lived experience. Even well-intentioned feedback has a tendency to take us further from ourselves and our ability to be present. So people who fall outside of the dominant default end up working too hard to be heard by over-prioritizing how we're being perceived instead of focusing on what we want to say. These external systems create an internal voice that fuels unspoken anxiety and layers of overworking, overthinking, and over-preparing, all signs of hypervigilance triggered by traumatic workplaces. Every single day, I hear from people who experience this near constant subconscious undercurrent of negative self-talk. Thoughts like, am I making sense? Do I sound confident enough? That literally splinter their ability to be comfortable and at ease. Every day, I also hear from organizations who want to hear from more voices. They want people to have more confidence or more executive presence. But without training and support, that critique only makes people feel less confident and less present. 2021 research from UKG showed that 4 out of 5 people feel unheard at work, with almost half of all respondents saying that underrepresented voices are completely undervalued by leadership. Instead of critiquing voices, we have to create workplaces and social spaces where people feel seen, safe, and supported speaking up, both in the Zooms and in rooms like this. Because the last few years have drastically changed how we communicate, connect, and collaborate, and we're not talking about it. This new virtual reality is leaving us all distracted, divided, and disconnected as we shrink ourselves into these tiny devices. Zoom perpetuates oppressive systems with behaviors like speaking over, interrupting, and putting people on the spot. And as a nation, we are reeling from endless gun violence, police brutality with no accountability, and legislation designed to limit bodily autonomy for anyone with a uterus and trans and gendered non-conforming people like me. These silencing systems impact those who experience systemic racism most of all. I've been collecting data in my work for years, and it shows that 96% of us are experiencing anxiety at work, and only 13% of respondents feel good about their ability to articulate ideas off the cuff in important moments. Wow. This data is not just from my private clients. This is from hundreds of people I've seen in corporate workshops at all levels of seniority in nearly every industry, from healthcare to technology, financial services to nonprofits. Oh, and it's from remote workers and essential workers. And this data is consistent with pre-COVID numbers. And it's not just in public speaking moments like this, which most of us can avoid. Can you hear my heart beating out of my chest? We are speaking in public constantly, on social media, in Zoom meetings, in tiny cameras that have entered our homes. I once facilitated a workshop with revenue leaders at one of the top tech companies in the world. In anonymous surveys, 100% of the room admitted that they struggle speaking off the cuff in important moments. 100% of the room. Sales leaders. Other times when I ask groups to self-identify without that anonymity, oftentimes not one person will raise their hands. Who here struggles to speak off the cuff in important impromptu moments? Wow. This is our unspoken anxiety. We are suffering in silence and we're not talking about it. And it creates extra layers of shame, secrecy, and stigma because we blame ourselves, especially in workplaces that prioritize perfectionism. Being heard is not about armoring up, saying the right thing, or getting a word in. Being heard is about rejecting executive presence, fake it till you make it, and calls for confidence, and prioritizing our ability to be present with ourselves over how we're being perceived. I believe our voices are vehicles for liberation from internalized anxiety and systemic oppression. We all have unique combinations of societal privileges and challenges that we can leverage to shift silencing systems, especially if you have compounding privileges due to your identities aligning with the dominant default. When we shift and critique the behaviors and expectations of silencing systems, we create environments where we can all be heard. Let's practice finding the present moment together. Lean back and feel your back on the chair. You're welcome to close your eyes, but you don't have to. Center your attention where your back hits the chair. Can you feel it? It's a gentle focus. Are you thinking about it? Each time you realize you're in unconscious thought, refocus your attention to that physical sensation, to anything outside of the thinking mind. Your back on the chair, your foot in your shoe, the sound of my voice. You're welcome to open your eyes. Thank you. Have you noticed how many of us are leaning in over the last few years, especially on Zoom calls? This is not new to the pandemic, but leaning in feeds, speaking fast, talking over each other, getting absorbed by the dominant default. It's also habitual, so it feeds habitual communication and anxiety. Just by leaning back, we bring ourselves to the present moment and invite others there as well. Leaning back creates more space in conversations. It also improves hormonal confidence. We do not need to be better communicators. We need to be present communicators so that we can lean back into ourselves and cultivate conversational comfort for those around us. When we focus our attention in the present moment, we consolidate our power. That is meditation with other people. We can share that power by giving others the rare gift of our full attention, our presence, when we have the privilege to do so. Every single one of us benefits when we dismantle systems silencing voices in our society. The more seen, safe, and supported we all feel speaking up as ourselves, the harder it will be to silence us. Thank you.